average in Mississippi was 731%. Now, there were some counties, so if that's the average in Mississippi, what do you think the worst was? What do you think? You're like, I dare not guess. Oh, scary. Yeah. What do you think? Yeah. 900, higher. Higher. 1,500% differential between the funding for white school children and black school children. In Jackson, Mississippi, 60% of the school-age population was African American. They received 9% of the budget. Last time I saw figures like that, it was apartheid South Africa. The result was that in these deep South states, over 50% of all black adults had less than 5 years of formal education. Over 50%. This eddies through into issues of health care. And we know this. We know the intersectionality, how connected, intertwined human rights are. So when one piece is wobbling over here, the rest of it starts falling like dominoes. In terms of health care, you know black folks couldn't get into the University of Mississippi med school, or Alabama's, or Georgia's, or Emory's. But we know there's always the North, the promised land. Woo. In the North, northern schools graduated 15 African Americans a year. There were some schools that took none and were proud of it. 15 a year. 2 HBCUs were responsible for producing 85% of all black physicians in the United States. Yeah. If it wasn't for Howard and Meharry, those numbers would be even more horrific. But Howard and Meharry could not produce enough. And so you ended up with these crazy differentials. Again, we're going to do this again. Okay, so the American Medical Association said, you need 1 doctor for every 1,500 in the population. What do you think the average was for African Americans? The actual average. Ooh, wasn't that high for the average? Come on. Yeah, y'all got used to being so bad. 1 for every 3,337. What do you think it was for Mississippi? Oh, why y'all make yourself so pickable? 1 for every 7,000, higher. 10,000, higher. 15, higher. 20, a little bit lower. 1 for every 18,527. You think you can't get into your doctor? Imagine what your health care looks like under those conditions. And so the NAACP did its human rights survey and approached this saying, we're getting ready to change the name of the game. The US is talking about this as a war for freedom. This is a war for democracy. This is a war for the 4 freedoms. Okay, we're getting ready to roll like that. You're going to put your money where your mouth is, son. Well, the Southern Democrats looked up and said, no. Senator James O. Eastland out of Mississippi. It's almost the default answer, isn't it? They asked him in 1944, what you fighting for? And he said, we're fighting to maintain white supremacy. 1944. You begin to think about that. That war began in 39. 45, the war was over. We know what and who the Nazis are. And the Southern Democrats controlled 2/3 of the major seats in Congress, 2/3 of the chairmanships of these major committees. And they were willing to lock down. So as the NAACP and its allies are pushing for a human rights front, you have the Southern Democrats pushing back really hard to maintain white supremacy. The first piece on that battle was at the UN conference in San Francisco, where the American Jewish Congress and the NAACP fought hard. I mean, throwing out all of the cards saying, we're getting ready to go tell the world how trifling you are if you do not put a human rights standard in this UN charter. We're getting ready to tell the world, you know we have over 1,000 branches, and you know we have leads into the major news outlets. We are going to tell the world. State Department had its own Scooby-Doo moment. Oh, crap. So what they came up with was this language sitting right there in the UN Charter saying, there shall not be discrimination on account of race, language, religion, or sex. And, you know, and the NAACP, I know it's really hard to believe because they're so buttoned down, right? They almost did a Michael Jackson moonwalk. But then, because the empire strikes back, John Foster Dulles, he worked out a deal with the British who wanted to keep their colonialism hidden and the Soviets who wanted to keep their mess hidden, what was called the Domestic Jurisdiction Clause, Article 2, Section 7, that said nothing in the Charter shall authorize intervention in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the state concerned. The NAACP said, whoa, son. That sounds like you wouldn't have been able to stop the Nazis. They're like, yeah, that's right. But when you read behind what they're saying in the State Department is what Article 2, Section 7 does, and you gotta love this. It means that the UN, quote, could not require a state to change its immigration policy or its Jim Crow legislation, unquote. This is very deliberate. It is very clear what this is designed to do. Other nations were hollering. The U.S. said, we don't care. You don't sign off on Article 2, Section 7. We back away from this organization. Nobody wanted the U.S. to back away again. And folks acquiesced. But then came the Cold War. And for the U.S., the human rights became this thing where they're like, but you know, I mean, we got our issues. Okay, so, you know, we've got gender discrimination. We've got really bad immigration laws. We got Jim Crow. Oh my God, what we've done to the Native Americans is like really foul. Really foul. Okay, so we've got some issues. But the Soviets are worse. So we got to figure out how to use human rights as a Cold War cudgel to beat up on the Soviets and protect ourselves. What they came up with is this kind of crazy. I'm telling you, sometimes when I was in those papers, I felt like I was in the world of Kafka meets Alice in Wonderland. So there was this subcommission on the protection of minorities and the prevention of discrimination. And the Soviets had pushed that through as the US had pushed through one on freedom of the press. Well, the US looked at this one going, oh man. And so what they came up with, and I know I have to, what they came up with was that they came up with a definition of minorities that meant, as they said, there are no minorities in the United States. Now we know where the first crack was smoked. I mean, it's like, Lord, you can't make this stuff up. They also took the lead in the drafting of the Covenant on Human Rights. And then on this covenant, which is a treaty, the point was first to break it in two, to put political and civil rights over here, economic and social rights over there, and then to treat economic and social rights like those aren't rights at all. As they said, those are mere aspirations. And what they really said, I love this stuff behind closed doors, and I love that they write it down. What they said is, this is just the inarticulate Slavic desire for the economic well-being of the masses. I bet y'all didn't know that. Because what you saw was the coupling, the linkage of economic and social rights with Marxism, with communism. And as you have the second Red Scare coming, that is a linkage that becomes really fraught with danger. It becomes toxic. I'm going to get past some of this. Well, the NAACP is still dealing with one physician for every 18,527. It's still dealing with a 1,500% differential in funding for Black children's education. And so it decides to go take its case to the UN. Because we had a series of lynchings and a whole bunch of mess happening where all the governments were like, oh, there's nothing we could do. And it's like, well, let me go find somebody who can do something. So they took it to the UN. And it is a powerful petition called An Appeal to the World. And let me just read a piece of it for you. Quote, "There is general agreement that the fundamental human rights which members of the United Nations are pledged to promote, without distinction as to race, include education, employment, housing, and health. And it is clear that the Negro in the United States is the victim of wide deprivation of each of these rights," unquote. The petition went on to say that the right to education was particularly egregious because, quote, those who would, the denial of the right to education, let me be more clear, because those who would continue to exploit the Negro politically and economically have first tried to keep his mind in shackles, unquote. Now, when this petition hit the UN, it was like you had to put a depends on the State Department. I couldn't write that in the book. The editor had a problem with that one. And so, I need to stop, Lord Jesus. So, the State Department went, oh my God, how do we stop this? Because they had swatted away one from a smaller Black communist organization. But this is the NAACP, 500,000 dues-paying members. This thing is a behemoth. This thing is like Godzilla coming at you, right? And it's got credibility. So it's like, now, what do we do with this? What do we do with this? What do we do with this? What do we do? I don't know. Let's go call Eleanor. So they called Eleanor Roosevelt, who was on the board of directors of the NAACP, who was chair of the Commission on Human Rights. And obviously, Eleanor must not have been reading her minutes from the meetings because this thing surprised her too. And she went, oh, and she went, oh, no. So part of what you see is the American delegation doing every kind of Robert's Rules of Order to keep this thing from ever hitting the agenda. Because the Soviets are looking at this like manna from heaven. And when you have communists praising God, and so Eleanor went to Walter White, the head of the NAACP, and said, I don't know what went upside in your mind. What were you thinking? And he said, well, I was thinking that Black folks are being massively oppressed. She said, that's not what I asked you. I asked you, what were you thinking? This is the Cold War. How could you embarrass the United States like this? And see, and again, I'm going, then don't make yourself so pickable. And he's like, well, the point wasn't to embarrass. The point was, in fact, to get some traction and some movement on the human rights that African Americans are systematically denied. And she said, no, you don't hear me, son. I got to take you out to the woodshed. And he went, oh. And she did. She said, only a communist-dominated organization would pull a stunt like this. And then she resigned from the board of directors of the NAACP. Now, this is 1947. What it means to have a powerful first lady's name on your letterhead, you know, this is some of that pragmatic stuff, can open up doors like none other. And to have Eleanor remove her name, her influence from that organization, Walter looked like James Brown. Please, please. I mean, he's begging her, don't go. And she's like, and I mean, he's on his knees. Those letters are plaintive wails. You have to come back. Please come back. Please don't leave me, Eleanor. And it was really clear that the deal that was cut was that you don't talk about human rights here in the United States. How much time, how am I doing for time, Edgem? Okay. So that, thank you, that should have been enough, right? But no, because the empire is a dog. When the Republicans came to power, the first thing coming out the chute was this thing called the Bricker Amendment. The Bricker Amendment was a way, I mean, it was designed, it had the NAACP called it this evil alliance between the Republicans and the Southern Democrats. And it was designed to stop human rights treaties from becoming the law of the land. You know that little basic civics lesson, how a treaty becomes the law of the land? I'm telling you, senators looked at that and went, oh, no. Now, interestingly enough, the one that got them was the Genocide Convention. I know that sounds, I mean, because who could be against the Genocide Convention? Who could be against, you know, no, you don't slaughter folk. I mean, that should be like the non-starter. But the Southern Democrats looked up there and said, oh, no, this looks like a backdoor method to a federal anti-lynching bill. And the State Department, okay, and this is when I slammed the papers down and walked out of the National Archives. The State Department said, no, not enough Negroes have been lynched yet to constitute genocide. What Bricker would do was to change the ways that treaties are ratified. So you know it's 2/3 of the Senate. With Bricker, it was going to be 2/3 of the Senate, then the way a bill becomes a law. We all remember our Saturday, was it Saturday cartoon, how a bill becomes a law thing. So how a bill becomes a law, and then, this was the kicker, all 48 state legislatures had to approve the treaty before it became the law of the land. Now, I want you to begin to think about the state legislature in Georgia. Yeah, I mean, it's frightening, isn't it? This is stuff nightmares are made of. Talking about human rights, talking about a genocide convention, talking about the right to education, the right to housing, the right to health care. And think about how in those conversations, so you may get every 47 states, which would be saying yes, but if you get Georgia and Mississippi saying, it doesn't become the law of the land. Now, Eisenhower looked up. President Eisenhower looked up and went, oh, what y'all doing to me? I mean, this is supposed to be like, we're supposed to be the big dog on the international stage, and if I have to get every kind of treaty through Mississippi, it's never going to happen. They're like, yeah, it be that way sometimes. He's like, no, really, 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 truly. No, be's that way sometimes. And so he sent John Foster Dulles up on the hill to plead with these folks. Reverend Fred Shuttleworth used to say, you can't shame a rattlesnake. And he's trying, and finally says, I'm going to tell you what. Boom, we're going to stop dealing with all of these treaties. We're going to stop being involved in the drafting of these treaties. You want the Genocide Convention? Boom, there it is. You want the Convention on the Political Rights of Women? Boom, there it is. You want the Convention on Anti-Slavery? Boom, there it is. You want the one on civil and political rights? Boom, economic, boom. Cool? And they went, nah, that just proves these things are really deadly. We're moving forward. Eisenhower didn't know what to do. In the end, part of what you saw with these folks is that they swaddled themselves in the flag. They swaddled themselves in protecting America, protecting our values, protecting our Constitution from all of these foreigners. You read this stuff and it is dripping with xenophobia. And by swaddling themselves in the flag, they come off as patriotic. And human rights comes off as this communistic Scud missile sent to destroy everything that we hold dear. When the vote came down, they're counting heads. And it's neck and neck, neck and neck, neck and neck, neck and neck, neck and neck. And then finally, boom, 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 it looks like Bricker's got his votes. And they're sitting there like, yeah. Or it was like, mwah. And then somebody says, where's Harley? Where's Harley? And that's Harley Kilgore, Democrat out of West Virginia. So they send the pages running all over the building looking for Harley in the midst of the showdown of this really critical vote. They're running all around, and finally somebody says, has anybody tried the bar across the street? You can't make this stuff up. Sure enough, they walk into the bar, and there's Harley, lit. I believe it was an alcohol level of 0.3. One aide gets under this arm, one aide gets under that arm. They drag him, you can't make this stuff up, they drag him back across the street. They sling open the Senate doors, he comes in, they're like, oh, I see our esteemed senator from West Virginia, how do you vote? And you hear, nay. Nobody knows if it was Harley. But the Brooker Amendment went down by one drunken vote. It really was a Pyrrhic victory, though, because what it did was to emblazon the sense that there was something dangerous about human rights, that there was something foreign about human rights, that what was happening in America was good enough, and there was no need for human rights. So as the civil rights movement is beginning in about 1954, 1955, it didn't have the frame in order to deal with the depth of degradation that had happened from centuries of slavery and Jim Crow. And so as one victory after the other led to greater exposure of the human rights remains in the Black community, it became clear that the roots of the systemic inequalities remained even after all of the blood, all of the struggle, and all of the martyrs. In 1985, Bayard Rustin, who was the logistics genius behind the 1963 March on Washington, he told a college audience, quote, "The problems of the early 60s were more easily solved than our current dilemma. First of all, it did not cost the government billions of dollars to do away with segregation and public accommodations, to give us the right to vote, to integrate the schools," unquote. Now, he made clear that these gains were not without cost. Quote, "It took the bombing of churches and the murder of innocents, but it was still fairly easy to get most Americans to understand that it was un-American to continue segregation, unquote. But he warned that the next phase of the struggle would be even more trying because, quote, we are now asking for education, medical care, jobs, and housing, unquote. In short, human rights. In March 2004, 50 years after Brown and 40 years after the landmark Civil Rights Act, the National Urban League asked, how much closer is America to achieving equality between blacks and whites since the Civil Rights Movement? It summed up that black progress is precarious at best, and understand this is before the recession. On every human rights indicator, housing, healthcare, education, employment, African Americans at that time had attained roughly 73% of the access to society as had whites. Now, these are the conditions that then led Senator Barack Obama in 2005 to assert, as he looked at New Orleans, quote, I hope we realize that the people of New Orleans weren't just abandoned during the hurricane. They were abandoned long ago to substandard schools, to dilapidated housing, to inadequate health care, to a pervasive sense of hopelessness, unquote. I want to thank you for keeping hope alive. Thank you. Ow. Thank you. Wow. Thank you.